Hey everybody, and welcome to our Week 2 edition of Fantasy Football 3-2-1. I'm your host, Jared Morris. Today I'm going to talk about 3 guys who performed really well in Week 1 that I'm not sure I trust moving forward. Then I'm going to talk about 2 guys who performed really well that I do trust and who I think are going to continue to put up those kind of numbers. And then finally, I'm going to give you my one piece of advice like I do every week. So let's talk about the 3 guys that did well that I'm not sure I trust. And let's start in Jacksonville with quarterback David Garrard. Now this is a guy that I've had on my team in many past seasons as a backup quarterback. And he's always done okay. But he's not 3 touchdowns good. And he's going to suck a lot of people in with that Week 1 performance with 3 touchdowns against Denver. But remember, he's a guy who's always performed very well at home, but hasn't necessarily done well on the road. And he's capable of putting up one of these 3 touchdown games every season or so. Just don't expect it every week. And the same goes for Matt Hasselbeck up in Seattle. He had a really good game against San Francisco. I wouldn't expect him to do that every week because they just don't have the weapons on offense to do it week in, week out. I think they just ran into a San Francisco team that wasn't ready to play. Now, the second guy is running back Darren McFadden of the Oakland Raiders. This is a guy who tantalized people with his talent when he was in college at Arkansas. He was a high draft pick. There have been high expectations for him ever since he came into the league, and he just hasn't done it consistently. Well, he played very well last week against Tennessee, but you got to remember, Michael Bush was out, so all of the touches went to McFadden. He was catching passes out of the backfield, running the ball well, but he can't possibly keep up that kind of production when it becomes a timeshare again with Michael Bush. So while, hey, maybe this is the season that Darren McFadden finally, fulfills his potential and becomes a game-breaking, consistent back, you can't expect the numbers that he put up in Week 1, and I'd still be worried about trusting him on a week-in, week-out basis. And finally, the third guy is Austin Collie, the wide receiver from the Colts. Now, I know he's a guy that people are really high on. I mean, he had 10 catches, he's over 100 yards in Week 1. He was outstanding. And I do like him a lot in Week 2 when the Colts play the Giants. Because I think, you saw Pierre Garçon drop passes, you saw Anthony Gonzalez drop passes. Peyton's going to start to trust Austin Collie. But remember, you got Reggie Wayne, you got Dallas Clark, you got Joseph Adai. These are all threats in the passing game to take targets away from Collie. So, I've seen people asking me questions, treating Collie like he's a number 1 wide receiver. He's not. Still think of this guy as a number 3 wide receiver that every now and then is going to have number 2 upside, but don't expect this to be some big breakout season where he becomes the next Wes Welker. Collie's a solid player, not a great player. All right, now let's talk about 2 guys who performed well in Week 1 that I think continue this kind of production. And we're going to start with Peyton's brother Eli, who we're going to see on Sunday night playing in the Manning Bowl when the Colts take on the Giants. Now, Eli threw 3 touchdowns in Week 1 against Carolina, all 3 of them going to Hakeem Nicks, another guy I like, by the way. Now, I like Manning a lot this year. I actually think this is the first season that he could throw 30-plus touchdowns in his career. And the reason why is I think he has one of the most underrated wide receiver cores in football. When you look at Hakeem Nicks, Steve Smith, and then also Mario Manningham. Add to it a solid running attack with Ahmad Bradshaw and Brandon Jacobs, and the Giants have an underrated offensive juggernaut building. So they didn't play well last year. I think their defense is going to be better. I think offensively they're going to be better this year. And I think finally this is the year that Eli Manning steps into being a consistent number 1 fantasy starting quarterback. Now, the second guy that I like is a guy that everybody likes after his Week 1 performance, which was record-setting. And I'm talking about Arian Foster. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on him. He looked great. He's in a high-powered offense. And though the Texans haven't produced consistent running backs from year to year that are top producers, it does always seem like whoever's playing in their backfield is producing. Whether it was Arian Foster at the end of last year, Steve Slayton before that, and there have been plenty of guys, before them even, who, for a year at a time, proved to be good fantasy runners. So does Arian Foster have staying power for the next 5 or 6 years? I don't know. Is he going to be good this year? Yes. He's not going to be 200-plus yards, 3 touchdown good every week, but this is a guy who's got a chance to put up consistent numbers. Some weeks as a number 1 back, but certainly consistently as a number 2 guy. All right, and finally, my one piece of advice for Week 2, and I have to admit, I have to hold my head in shame a little bit. As you know, I'm participating in the Blogger Fantasy Football League, and the winner gets a chance to go to the Super Bowl, all expense-paid trip to Super Bowl 45 in Dallas. Well, my first week of this league that I've put a lot of time into researching and setting my lineups, and I really want to do well, and I started Sidney Rice. And as you know, Sidney Rice is on the PUP list. He's not going to play for the first 6 weeks of the season. And yet there he is, sitting on my starting roster. I meant to put Josh Morgan in because he's my 4th receiver. I dragged him up, accidentally clicked the spot for Mike Wallace instead of Sidney Rice, and there he's sitting. So my piece of advice is make sure on Sunday put away 5-10 minutes just to go check your rosters and make sure you don't have any injured guys sitting on your roster. It didn't cost me a loss. I got killed by about 30 points in that one league. So that obviously would have disappointed me a lot more. But who knows? It could have cost me. And if that cost me a victory and then it cost me a chance to go to the Super Bowl, well, that's a pretty costly mistake. So learn from me, make sure it doesn't happen to you, ensure that you don't have anybody injured on your starting roster. All right, everybody, that's Fantasy Football 3-2-1 for Week 2. Good luck setting your rosters, and ask us any questions because our goal is to help you win.